Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan and today I'm going to be taking you on a journey throughout the NHL's entire 103-year existence. Now in those 103 years we've seen some fantastic players come through the ranks and become stars in the league, but there's been a select few that have been absolutely dominant in their decades. And we have 10 decades of NHL hockey to look at and see the best players from each. But who do I see as some of the best players from each decade in the NHL, and who do I see as the best players of all time in the National Hockey League? Watch till the end for the entire list and the entire rankings, and hit that subscribe button if you're new. 65% of the people that watch these videos are not subscribed, so join the Grab Gang for more hockey content just like this one. And we're going to turn the Wayback Machine all the way to the 1910s, more than 100 years ago, to the first NHL seasons. And in the early 2010s, the NHL wasn't even a thing. There was the National Hockey Association, and some of the owners and some of the teams ended up splitting off that league to create their own league in the National Hockey League as we know it today. And there was only a few seasons completely in the 1910s. There was a 1917-18 season and the 1918-19 season, and then the next one, of course, would start the 1920s. So there's only a few players to really choose from here, but one of the main ones that stood out to me was Cy Denneny. He was a 5'7" left winger, and in his time throughout the first few seasons in the NHL, in 39 games, got 54 goals, 16 assists for 70 points. That's a main sniper if I've ever heard one. He was mostly playing with the original Ottawa Senators, the teams that were an absolute dynasty in his career, ended up winning 4 Stanley Cups, getting inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, and I think truly being the standout player of the 1910s and his era, especially for the Ottawa Senators. And even though Cy Denneny was a really good player, the NHL still didn't have their first true superstar until the 1920s, where Howie Morenz, the 5'9" center for the Montreal Canadiens, rose up the ranks to become one of the best players of just the first couple of decades in National Hockey League history. Now, he, of course, mainly played with the Montreal Canadiens. He ended up winning 3 Hart Trophies, 3 Stanley Cups. He was really the first NHL superstar and ended up being inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. And in his time throughout the decade, from 1920 to 1929, he ended up getting 214 games played in, 138 goals, 53 assists for 191 points. Once again, was truly an absolute sniper with that 138 goal mark, but was just the NHL's best pure player throughout most of that decade, and especially in his best seasons, was easily the most dominant guy. There was a couple other players that do come to mind. George Vezina was also fantastic in the 1920s for the Habs. You also had Babe Dye, one of the best fantastic names of all time in the NHL, but for the most part, Howie Morenz was the man in the 1920s and was the main reason why the Montreal Canadiens were so good getting those 3 Stanley Cups. But even though Howie Morenz was the NHL's first superstar, he would definitely not be the last. In the 1930s, ended up coming to the scene was defenseman Eddie Shore, and he was one of the best players in the NHL, while also being probably the best player for an American team in the Boston Bruins, really starting to make hockey more accessible in North America, and he was one of the main reasons why, being so good for the Boston Bruins. And in his time, ended up getting 441 games played from 1930 to 1939, ended up getting 66 goals, 156 assists for 222 points. He ended up winning 2 Stanley Cups, 4 Hart Trophies, is in the Hall of Fame, and most notably has acquired 900 stitches on his body throughout his entire hockey career. So, not a bad one. He makes up for less cups than a guy like Howie Morenz with more stitches. So, who really wins in this debate? I think it's Eddie Shore. Let's be honest. And now we can go on to the 4th decade in National Hockey League history in the 1940s. And although there was a lot of stuff going on in North America at the time, there was also a lot of stuff going on in the NHL as well. And this would be a fantastic era for up-and-coming young players. But the main one for the Montreal Canadiens was Maurice Richard. 5'10" winger just burst onto the scene in the decade, and during the 1940 to 1949 seasons ended up getting 334 games played, 207 goals, 142 assists for 349 points. And the accolades go on, end up winning 8 cups. The 1947 Hart will be the first player to ever score 50 goals in his legendary 1945 season, and of course would be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. At that point was the NHL's best player and would go down as the NHL's best player until we go to the player that ended up dominating in the decade right after. In the 1950s, the Detroit Red Wings found themselves a pretty decent player for their franchise and a guy that would lead them to so many fantastic moments, that being the legend himself, Gordie Howe. Gordie Howe, of course, is one of the best NHL players of all time. And while Maurice Richard is likely one of the best goal scorers of all time, Gordie Howe is one of the best players just in general, as he deserves to be. He's just played so many games, but during that 1950 era, and of getting 686 games played, actually, was it 860? 888, my apologies, and 383 goals, 418 assists for 801 points. That is just a legendary stat line, and he was just, simply put, brilliant. And when it comes to his accolades, he of course is in the Hockey Hall of Fame, won 6 Hart trophies, 6 Art Ross trophies, 4 Stanley Cups, 21-time All-Star, by the way, and he would define an era of fantastic players too. There's some pretty good honorable mentions for the 1950s, at least. There is some good players like John Beliveau, of course. You got Doug Harvey, Jacques Plante, and some really great players for the Montreal Canadiens. But for the Detroit Red Wings, of course, Gordie Howe was the man and led them to amazing success for just him and that team in general, and would define an era in hockey history. And we're now going to go on to the 1960s, and I want to make it known that I'm not going to have duplicate players for different decades, so I'm not going to have Gordie Howe as the 60s guy as well, or Gretzky as the 80s and 90s player, just to have one player for each decade. That's what I'm going with right now. So for the 1960s, the guy I think dominated the most was Bobby Hull. In his time throughout the 60s, he ended up getting 679 games played, 441 goals, 359 assists for 800 points flat with the Chicago Blackhawks. He's in the Hockey Hall of Fame, and during his time, won the 1961 Cup, 2-time Hart Trophy winner, 3-time Art Ross, of course, is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. I would say the big honorable mention for me would be his teammate in Stan Mikita, and I do want to make it known also that I think Bobby Hull is an absolute trash person. Just look up Bobby Hull, N-A-Z-I, to know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I'm just going to move on from that because that's an absolute rabbit hole I do not want to go down right now. So we're just going to go on to the 1970s. How about that? So on to the 1970s, and the best player of that era, we saw some insane talent come through the ranks, but the main one, and I think everybody would agree, the best player of the 1970s was Boston Bruins defenseman Bobby Orr. To me, Bobby Orr was probably the best defenseman of all time, probably. I want to say that because I think there's a couple of pretty strong contenders for that spot, and a guy that I'll mention later as well, I think could be the #1 guy. But in the 1970s, Bobby Orr was a fantastic overall defenseman for the Boston Bruins, and during that 70s decade, got 483 games played in, 225 goals, 554 assists for 779 points. Was just a beast for the Bruins. 2-time Stanley Cup, 3-time Hart, 8 Norris Trophy winners, 2 Art Ross Trophy winners as a defenseman, 2-time Conn Smythe winner, 1967 Calder as well. Was just pretty much every accolade you can think of. Also, of course, is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Of course, the big thing was injuries, and that held him back from truly points-wise being like the best of all time definitively. But Bobby Orr was still sensational when he was playing, and when he was on the ice for the Bruins, there was no doubt that he was going to make something happen, and that was just the case throughout the whole decade and still later on as well for the Boston Bruins. There, I do want to mention a lot of honorable mentions though, because there are some fantastic players that will not get mentioned because of that, but guys like Guy Lafleur, Bobby Clarke, Phil Esposito, and Ken Dryden of the Montreal Canadiens were all elite, fantastic players, and some of the best players in NHL history as well. And we're now going to go into the 1980s, and before I mention the obvious player, we got to give some credit to some players that are some of the best in NHL history that, of course, because of this player, don't get mentioned as often. Mario Lemieux, of course, started in the 80s and was fantastic, especially in the late 80s for the Penguins. We'll mention him in a minute. He's pretty good as well. Some fantastic defensemen like Ray Bourque and Paul Coffey, who were legendary at their positions, and some amazing forwards like Mike Bossy and Mark Messier, who still forward-wise are some of the best in NHL history. But we got to give credit to where it's due. The best player of this generation and the best player of all time. Let's be honest here. I mean, there's no doubt it's Grant Fuhr. One of the best goaltender of... no, it's Wayne Gretzky, of course, but Grant Fuhr's pretty good. I mean, let's be real here. Grant Fuhr's pretty all right. But Wayne Gretzky, of course, is the man. During the 80s, played 774 games played, 637 goals, and got a clean 1,200 assists for 1,837 points. That was just in the 80s, by the way. I'm not over. That was just in the 80s, and of course for the Oilers, just in general, who wins 4 Stanley Cups, 9 Hart trophies, 10 Hart Ross trophies, 2 Conn Smythe trophies, and will be in the Hockey Hall of Fame. A decent little career for the guy, but he's definitely not Grant Fuhr. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's just. Wayne, you're not Grand Fuhrer. Better luck next time. And now we can get on to the 1990s and give the legend his credits, and that, of course, is Mario Lemieux of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Mario Lemieux obviously had some of his best years in the late 80s, but throughout the 90s was excellent as well. In that time, played only 377 games, but got 313 goals, 466 assists for a measly 779 points. In his just career in general, won 2 Stanley Cups with the Pens, 2 Hart trophies, 6 Art Ross trophies, 2 Conn Smythes, and of course the Hockey Hall of Fame marker. I mean, if we're talking about if players were fully healthy, guys like Bobby Orr, who I think dominated the 70s, guys like Mario Lemieux, obviously if he was healthy, could have the case, I think, really to maybe be the better player than Wayne Gretzky. But even though that is the case and he wasn't that healthy, I would still prefer Wayne Gretzky over him. But let's be real here. I mean, it's like apples and oranges that are the gods of apples and oranges. They're both absolutely insane. And I think one of the main things that I find funny is like people that say that Wayne Gretzky would be like a third liner in today's NHL. No, you're stupid. Come on. And especially Mario Lemieux, I think would just do insane today. Like he would be perfectly fit for today, even more than somewhat than I think Wayne Gretzky would be a little bit more. But I think when it comes to Mario Lemieux, still, if he's not the best player of all time, is the second best player of all time, and I think deserves to be for sure. Was a legend not just for the Pittsburgh Penguins, but for hockey in general, and showed how good a player in the East Coast could be as well. But then we go on to the 2000s, and this I'm pretty sure was the first decade that I watched hockey. Of course, I was born in 2003, and I faintly remember watching the 2009 Pittsburgh Penguins. I would later get into hockey later in the 2010s, but yeah, that would be the first decade that I'll be watching hockey. And for the 2000s, to me, there is quite a few options. By the way, I forgot to mention some of the honorable mentions for the 90s, so I guess I'll just go over that. Guys like Adam Oates, Jaromir Jagr, Steve Eisman, Joe Sakic, Eric Lindros, Timo Solani, Dominik Hasek, Patrick Waugh, Martin Brodeur, some decent players. You might know them. But now we're going to officially go on to the 2000s. And for me, what I would say is the best player. There's quite a few options, and there was also a lot of players that dominated both the 2000s and the 2010s, which we'll get into as well. But in my opinion, the best player throughout the 2000s and most consistently as well was Detroit Red Wings defenseman Nicklas Lidstrom. In my opinion, I said earlier that Bobby Orr is probably the best defenseman of all time. If I had to pick either one in terms of career and in terms of just what they brought, my bad, in terms of what they brought, to me, in my opinion, I think Nicklas Lidstrom is the best defenseman of all time. And I think, obviously, Red Wings fans will like that opinion. But to me, with just what Lidstrom brought on a daily basis, what he was able to provide for the Red Wings was just so extremely valuable. And to me, is the best Swede of all time, the best defenseman of all time, and was just such a player, such a valuable player throughout the 2000s. I mean, we'll just look at his accolades compared to other defensemen of his era. He won 4 Stanley Cups, 7 Norris trophies, that got the 2002 Conn Smythe. Of course, he is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Throughout the 2000s, got 718 games played, 127 goals, 447 assists for 574 points, and a lot of that was due to a lot of that was during the dead puck era. A lot of that was just the goal scoring not being too high. But Nicklas Lidstrom was still putting up insane point numbers and was just a fantastic overall offensive defenseman, and even on defense was great too. To me, Nicklas Lidstrom is absolutely the man, not just in the 2000s, but one of the best players in NHL history. But we're going to go on to the last decade in NHL hockey. Technically, though, I guess you could count some of the 2020 as being done, but we'll get into that in a minute. Now we're going to go on to the 2010s, and this was the first decade that I started watching hockey, or consistently, I will say. But I would say with 2010, there was really only one obvious choice. There's quite a few other fantastic options, too. This was a player that dominated the late 2000s, and especially in the early 2010s, also faced some injury troubles, but just in terms of what he was able to do in the 2010s and just in his career in general, I think deserves to get this mark. That being for the Pittsburgh Penguins, their second player on this list, Sidney Crosby. I mean, we'll be honest here, with Sidney Crosby, He's another player that if he was fully healthy throughout the 2010s, there would be absolutely no doubt in my opinion. Obviously, you got some fantastic overall honorable mentions like Alex Ovechkin, Joe Thornton, Evgeny Malkin. You got some other options like Carey Price, Erik Karlsson, Patrick Kane, and even maybe you make a case for Connor McDavid late in the 2010s. But in terms of the whole decade, in terms of the all-around 2010s era, I think Sidney Crosby encapsulated it the most. During that time, of course, he got his 2016 and 2017 Cup, and just in his career in general, has at this point won 3 Stanley Cups, got 2 Hart trophies, 2 Maurice Richard trophies, 2 Art Ross trophies, 2 Conn Smythes as well, and has put together one of the most complete overall careers in hockey. I mean, those were just the NHL accolades. When we look at the Olympics and the World Juniors and the friggin', why am I forgetting it? The World Championships, whatever they're friggin' called. Who cares? Sidney Crosby has pretty much won it all and has done pretty much everything. And at that point, to me, he is the 2010s in a nutshell. But we can now talk about the 2020s, I guess. I mean, there's only been technically 1 season in it, though I would technically count this last season as it. And with this 2020s tab, I'm just gonna kind of predict who I think will be the player of the 2020s, and there's quite a few fantastic options here, but I still think he's kind of in the same position as Sidney Crosby, and not just in terms of where he was drafted, but how good he will be in the past decade and in this one. It'll probably be Connor McDavid of the Edmonton Oilers. I mean, if I'm being real here, I think Connor McDavid might have his best years still ahead. Obviously, you've seen how much he can do offensively, but in terms of what he can bring in the all-around game, I think there's a lot more that Connor McDavid can provide, especially on the defensive side of things, where he's kind of been poor in the last couple of seasons, but if he can turn that around, I think will definitely be the bona fide best player of this decade. I think the only reason that Nathan MacKinnon is maybe in the conversation better than Connor McDavid is just because Connor McDavid has been so poor defensively lately, but if he can turn that around in this 2020s decade, all around this next season, then that's a much different story. And I think Connor McDavid just has a lot to bring. He hasn't had as many injury troubles, thankfully, as Sidney Crosby has. And if he can stay healthy throughout the rest of this decade, I think he will be the guy. I mean, I think he's still like 23 or something. He's got a ton of time to get that Stanley Cup for the Edmonton Oilers. We'll see if that happens. It is the Edmonton Oilers, but still. But he's kind of reminds me of Sidney Crosby's placement to where he had some insane seasons in the late 2010s, but I think we'll also have some of his best seasons as well and might have more team success, hopefully, in the 2020s as well. There's going to be a lot of honorable mentions, I'll say here. Elias Pettersson could definitely be up there. Of course, Nathan MacKinnon. Shane Wright could be in the conversation. Austin Matthews could be up there, too, as players that just absolutely dominate this decade. You know, you can also have players even more in the future, like Matvei Michkov and Connor McDavid, that could be in that conversation, too, but this generation of NHL players is so astoundingly fun. So many young and fast players as well. Connor McDavid obviously encapsulates that the best, I would say. But this 2020s decade already started off with a pretty interesting season for 2020, and I'm really excited to see what the rest of this decade can provide. I mean, hey, we're almost through 2020, boys. It's almost done, so the best hopefully is ahead, not just in the NHL, but just in life in general. And with that, I'm going to leave this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell. Of course, if you have any thoughts, let me know down in the comments down below. What do you agree and disagree with, and who do you see as some of the best players of all time? And if you want to list the decades, let me know as well. Let me know down in the comments down below all your thoughts. Make sure you share this video with your friends. Get the decades list out there, and click on this card as well for all my hockey rankings videos right in one playlist. My name is Nathan. Thanks so much for watching today's episode, today's show, and I'll see you in the next video or stream. Goodbye.